Hey, on this episode of The Ethics Experts, we talked to Christopher Marquis, who wrote the book, The Profiteers, How Businesses Privatize Profits and Socialize Losses. It's a really interesting conversation about how to integrate economic profit thinking to counterbalance the slightly myopic, accounting-focused thinking that governs most of our organizations. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to The Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Ethics Experts. And hey, you cuties who subscribe to The Ethics Experts, I'm so glad you're here. And I love the way you love the people around you and serve them every day. And that's what you're going to get. If you're a subscriber to The Ethics Experts, every single episode, you get an extra and an extra special welcome. So welcome. I'm Gio Gallo. We got the inestimable Nick Gallo here, hey. And we're excited to have Christopher Marquis here, the Sinyi professor at the University of Cambridge Judge School of Business. Prior to that, he spent 17 years at Cornell, Harvard Business School, Harvard Kennedy School. He's a great author. Prior books included Better Business, How the B Corp is Remaking Capitalism, Mao and the Markets. He's a Financial Times Best Book of 2022. And we are going to be talking today about his latest book called The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you guys.
So to kick it off, you've written a few different books. Your book about the B Corp was super interesting. We had you on the show here a couple years ago. And this in some ways is kind of sticking with the theme, in some ways adding a really, new, potentially provocative angle to your view on business and markets and what it means to do well in business by doing good. So talk to me about where did you get this idea from?
Sure. Yeah. So, I appreciate you sort of seeing those connections because, sometimes people say to me, oh, you have a book called Better Business and you have a book called The Profiteers. This seems like, maybe you're schizophrenic or something, or you're, or your sort of ideas have changed. And my ideas have not really changed. I do at the core, really think that business and organizations and leaders are such a powerful, or can be such a powerful force for good in the world. But, there are really strong headwinds at times that make it a challenge for them to do that. And I think that The Profiteers, I really dig in initially in the first part of the book into what some of those challenges are and how in the very much the short-termism that dominates our financial markets, financial processes, creates sort of constraints on business leaders in order to how they're actually able to deliver responsibly to society. So this sort of socializes costs and privatizes profits, is the idea that, business is really taking a lot of costs that they should probably, if they were responsible, ethical companies, take on themselves. But because of this short-term pressure, they're putting them on the general public.
And where does this short-termism come from?
Yeah, good question. The short-termism really stems from changes that have occurred in the US initially, but really around the globe now, society, which started with a variety of ideas from Milton Friedman as sort of one of the more famous proponents of this, but also got encoded into laws. So there's now, sort of court, legal cases and court decisions that companies have to prioritize their financial shareholders if they're going to be, selling the company or doing some other, sort of major financial transaction. And then things like, stock options, which, actually sharing the wealth of the company is not a bad thing per se, but actually how those get constructed, they get very focused at the very top of the company on short-term stock price and a variety of other, sort of incentives or laws and even norms we have now, really orient business to the short term.
Yeah, we have this sort of systemic short-termism, and there's all these overlays of incentives that kind of reinforce this mentality. And yet you do see, though, some public company CEOs that say, I'm not going to get sucked into that. I mean, there are some that famously are like, I'm not giving any Wall Street guidance. I'm running this business over the long term. So, right. But that's very rare. kind of to your point.
Very, very rare, very rare. One of the more famous ones that I think is a really admirable leader is Paul Pullman, who is CEO of Unilever.
Yep.
Really reoriented them a lot around sustainability, and said very openly, this is a long-term performance play, and so quarterly guidance, we're not going to do it anymore, because that really just diverts us and sets the wrong expectations as far as what our overall growth path is.
Yeah, kind of puts everybody on a constant crash diet.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
at some level, right, it's sort of on leadership to put the right strategy in place for whatever they perceive their fiduciary duty to be. And there are very few cases, just in my experience, and what I've seen, where short-termism is a better sort of like net approach or strategy than long-termism. Like, I don't really know, I can't really sort of like codify or like put on a list of like, yep, this is when short-termism is best. I would say almost at like a broad brushstroke level, it's always long-termism. That's always the way
Right.
to grow better, grow more sustainably, have a more sort of like actual impact versus kind of a greenwashed impact or whatever kind of facade you want to kind of, call in that. And yet, despite that sort of understanding that I think most of us probably have coming up through MBA school or whatever, it's like the individual, like, feed me, I'm the CEO, give me my stock options, allows them to really engage in the short-termism, and that becomes the driving force, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I do think, so there is a variety of, so I think leaders can play a huge role in pushing back, but also, we have these sort of market systems and policy environments that also make it a challenge too. So, I think, for someone like Paul Pullman, he was in a very strong position after, leading Unilever for a number of years to be able to do that. But when you have institutional investors breathing down your neck as a CEO, and you've probably seen these cases where CEOs get thrown out because they aren't delivering for the investors.
Yep.
The investors create problems with them on their board. So it's a real challenge, actually.
Yeah, and I think in that case, the board is not saying, hey, you know what, we don't really like how long-term planning you've been doing. We want short-term. But, a lot of times that's the subtext or the undercurrent that's driving it. So
Right.
I think in this book, the somewhat provocative title notwithstanding, you're not saying business is bad and everything should, everyone should stop doing business. You're saying you're trying to drive this in a new way, a new kind of conception of how to maybe orient and sequence your goals and your activities. Is that a fair way to put it?
Exactly. And I think that part of that is trying to think about what some different systemic changes we could have are, but really driven very much by business leaders. So for example, some of the businesses that I've researched, scores, hundreds over the years, but really there's probably 15 to 20 that I dive deep in this book. A company like Grove Collaborative. I don't know if you know Grove, but it's a company that does sells sustainable housewares and things like cleaning products. And when I interviewed the CEO or former CEO, he's the board chair, Stu Landsberg, and said, tell me about your vision for Grove, how you see your sort of role in community and the world. And he said, the biggest externality in my business is plastic. And I am dedicated to eradicating plastic at the center of my business. And think about that. I mean, that is something a real leader would say, because he sees that actually the biggest issue as far as, contributing to the environment, is plastic. And so this created all kinds of innovation in the company. So they created new products, for instance, like shampoos. So if something's in liquid, it needs to be in something like plastic that is, non-permeable. Things like paper and other products don't, sort of other packaging doesn't work. So they innovated and came up with a shampoo bar that actually has won rave reviews from consumers and others. So this is an example of where, you can think about these sort of core issues of your business, like plastic, and say, how can I sort of innovate? So that's, sort of one example where a leader is thinking, creatively about trying to deal with these core issues.
Well,
yeah, it's completely reinventing the product, right? It's not just trying to greenwash it. It's saying,
Right.
hey, I'm willing to revamp my business, reimagine a core profit center in order to put this sustainability and eradicating plastic closer to the front of our goals. And I'm sure it takes not just like investing in some innovation, but rethinking. There are real costs to that, right? And that's part of what the book is about, is the improvement that would come from stopping, like no longer externalizing this cost means that you're bearing these costs. And I think a true leader is going to lead through that and say, hey, we don't have to just pay for these costs. We can work them off, or we can, innovate in our business to do it. But there is, like, you're bearing, some weight of that to stop putting that cost, externally outside the organization.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, it is and it's something that, a lot of businesses also are working together with other companies to create sort of, common standards and new ways of doing things. So another few companies that I've done a lot of research on over the years and are featured in the book are Dr. Bronner's and Patagonia. So
Dr. Bronner's is a crazy company.
Yeah, totally crazy.
Yeah. I love it.
They're great. They make great products. They're sort of the soap shampoo that I use at home. I'm a big fan of Dr. Bronner's. But they actually, very different industries. Dr. Bronner's is health and beauty, natural health and beauty. Patagonia is apparel, but they actually are working together with a number of other companies on new standards and certifications for agriculture.
Awesome.
They've created this new organization called the Regenerative Organic Association with the Rodale Institute and others to really reshape how agriculture is done in the US and in the world. Because, as you may know, how it is done right now, it's virtually monopolies that have these genetically engineered seeds that, farmers get caught in debt traps trying to buy them, and then they have to buy the chemicals that match them, which some of them are really bad. So this new standard, which is really becoming popular, is something that you can't beat. Monsanto, I guess, doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Bayer, but you can't beat these large companies just by being a little player. I mean, you have to actually work together with other like-minded organizations and create new systems. And there's all kinds of new sort of venture capital and other investment companies that are popping up because, part of this whole equation around agriculture actually relates to carbon emissions, carbon storage, carbon offsets. And so, if we can, in these companies see if we can unlock agriculture as not even being best for the planet as far as actually producing the actual product, but it also can help overall sort of issues around climate change.
Isn't this really kind of at its core a question of like economic versus accounting profit, and like what an organization wants to use to gauge their quote unquote profitability?
In some ways, and part of it, it goes down to this sort of long-term versus short-term issue that we talked about earlier. But I think as well, if you're just focused on the short term, you're not going to think about innovative ways to create change in the world. And this is where many of the companies that I studied, I think they're able to sort of they take a step back and have the vision to say, we want to get to a sustainable future. And just by making small improvements is not going to do that. It's actually trying to, think of ways to sort of reinvent things.
Yeah. The main difference, right, between accounting profit and economic profit is accounting profit is just explicit costs. Sure. Economic profit is explicit and implicit costs. And stock prices, P&Ls are only grabbing those implicit costs. And so I'm just kind of thinking about this example of like, a manufacturing business, they have all of this waste, right? It's kind of free from an explicit cost perspective, essentially free to like dump that into the river, but that has an implicit cost, an economic cost to the broad environment. And so if they were forced to bear both the implicit and the explicit cost, to your point, it's naturally going to drive some innovation to say like, how can I, I have to dispose of this. How can I do that in a more efficient way? Just by its nature, like because it's so hard to quantify those things and denominate those implicit costs sort of consistently across industries and all these different realms, it's just, easier or self-serving, whatever, to like look at a P&L that kind of excludes all of those costs. But that's really where all those societal costs live. You know what I mean?
Right. Totally. And thank you for explaining that. So your initial dichotomy between accounting and economic costs, I didn't catch it right away. But I think that's exactly sort of nail on the head of what I'm trying to do in this book, is really unpack that difference. And I think it's important to unpack that difference because, how accounting sort of occurs is things that we as humans and market participants actually have a say over.
Exactly.
And so to actually think about how we can introduce ways to keep business responsible is something that, investors are now working a lot on, policymakers. And I think the important thing to remember, and I have a chapter on this in the book, is that, companies are really, really savvy at understanding this difference and actually trying to avoid costs through, PR, communication, and lobbying. So, they want to keep their sort of responsibilities very skinny, so to speak. And if they can just throw the waste in the river, which they probably can't anymore, although they used to be able to, they're very happy to do that. Like, recycling of plastic is something that I think is the current day equivalent of like maybe, back early in the 20th century, throwing your waste in the river. This is something that has now been shown about 5 to 10% of plastic that is put in bins is actually recycled. But companies are still promoting recycling, that please recycle. The reason but they know it doesn't work. They've known since the 1970s that it's not going to work. There's now court documents that sort of show this, but it saves them a lot of money if they don't have to be like Grove Collaborative and think like how to actually reformulate their products and services.
And they get the benefit of appearing to be an economic accounting kind of a business, right? It's like, I care about this whole impact. And so that's such a complicating like layer, that's like such a layer of complication in the broad dynamic, because now you have these market participants in many cases who think that they are making that sort of, conscious, full kind of cost decision and saying, I'm going to put my money with this organization because they appear to be so,
conscious.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Then there's layers and layers of this, greenwashing or social, ESG washing, whatever you want to call it. That's so hard to see through,
Totally. And I think, this example, it is a real, it's very hard to see the different layers and how sophisticated this is. So there's a TV ad that I saw not that long ago. I was in the US, in some hotel and it was on. It just really infuriated me. Was it had 3 different, sort of young people, one from Coke, one from Pepsi, one from Dr. Pepper. And it was like a 30-second commercial about how, these 3 companies are all coming under the common interest of recycling. And they're coming together, putting aside their competitive differences to work together on this important issue. And, people can also chip in and do various things where, they're, and they know that this is not working. It's just greenwashing, basically.
Yeah, it's a joke. It's a performance,
Right. Yeah.
So Christopher, there's, we've talked a little bit about the short-termism that, it seems apparent that is like highly correlated with like a public company. And, maybe that's that's somewhat present in like a private equity owned company. I'm thinking about like different corporate structures, right? Like if, there's an ESOP, maybe they have a different view of this. There's a corporate structure that is, that is kind of age old of the, it's family owned and this family has been in this town for generations and they're part of the social fabric or whatever. So it seems like there might be some way to get at this improvement by evaluating the kind of pressures and incentives that are there based in your corporate structure. What else might a company be evaluating to see, hey, you know what, we're missing some of the pressure that's pushing us toward being a profiteer? What are some other ways that, like, places someone might look outside of corporate structure to kind of figure out, hey, where are we kind of getting some unknown pressure toward this, if they're already bought into the idea of, hey, you know what, I want to internalize these costs that I've been externalizing?
Yeah, well, I'm going to stay for a second on the corporate structure point that you just made, because I think it's super important. I mean, and I think that part of the issue is that, so much of how we think about companies, through sort of media, movies, whatever, is about large public companies.
Yeah.
But they're just a really small number of the companies in the world and in the United States. And the structures that you mentioned, and ESOPs, other forms of employee ownership, family ownership, these are structures that are much more long-term oriented. And I actually have a reasonable bit of amount of stuff in the book around employee ownership in particular, because I think that is hugely important to helping to, sort of even out some of our economic inequalities that exist today. So, I mean, I think that, an issue is that it's a cultural issue, how people are thinking about, like, the responsibility of companies and sort of responsibility of owners. And I think that these other forms are helping push in the opposite direction of that.
You said something that, that it's kind of cultural. And just to use shorthand as, like, the extent to which an organization is a quote unquote profiteer, shorthand being the extent to which they are pulling in, these sort of implicit costs along with the implicit cost to judge their profitability or whatever. You probably don't have data behind it, but, like, do you think the rate of that proportion of profiteer versus sort of better company is different in different sort of parts of the world? Like, you think, maybe drawing a line down the middle of the, map and saying east and west, do you think it's a difference there? Like, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm kind of asking?
Definitely. I mean, I think that the U.S. is a place where, is this really super strong short-termism, which drives part of this. I think with a lot of the sort of lobbying and campaign donations that companies can do, they're actually able to shape government in the US much stronger than, for instance, the EU or the UK. So I think that one division is down the Atlantic Ocean. I think another is more north-south. So
interesting.
Places like Latin America have a lot more family ownership and of businesses. And so that is a structure where, if your name is on the door, you're going to be thinking about the responsibility for many generations,
good point,
responsibility frequently for your community. So that's another, sort of difference. I do think there are global differences in this.
Yeah, but what a self-correcting mechanism when the reputation that you're protecting is literally on your driver's license, right? I mean, you're going to be thinking the implications of that can cascade across a family and cousins and all that kind of stuff. It does change the prioritization. And, as we've been talking through this, I've just been thinking about, like, the nature of priorities. Like, you can't do two things at once, I don't believe. Like, anytime someone's task switching, for example, you're not doing two things at once. You're doing one thing and the other thing back and forth. And, like, I think the same thing is true for priorities. You know what I'm saying? It's like, there's only one seat. There's only, two butt cheeks that can go in one, each seat. So, like, what's the big thing? And if the big thing is changing the sustainability thing, then everything else kind of is going to be subject to that, or, you know what I'm saying? It's going to fall, like, behind that in prioritization,
Exactly. And I think that sort of mission and purpose of companies, and this is why I think it's an important cultural issue as well, really is a lot of it's wrapped up in, short-term profits. But, you probably talk to more entrepreneurs than I do. So many of the entrepreneurs I talk to, they want to make a difference in the world through their the products, what they're passionate about as far as the innovation and what they're selling. Some certainly, want to get rich, and maybe, a lot of them are looking to, have a nice life based on the companies they created. But I think that their passion about what they're producing and the work that they're doing overrides their interest in being rich in many cases.
It could be that. It also could be a different view on how the machine works. Like, I want a nice life for sure. I want to leave something for my kids and grandkids or something like that.
Right.
But like, I don't think focusing on that is the way to achieve that. I think focusing on actually adding value and actually making the world better, actually making an impact. Like, I can't control the harvest, but I can control the seeds I plant. And those seeds, I think, lead to a better harvest than, overwatering the plants because I'm so concerned about how many bushels I'm going to get. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah, and I think that piece about how the machine works or what is the path to success, like a lot of those things are together, right? You're an entrepreneur, starting your startup on a card table or whatever it is. Success looks like probably all of those things, right? Like you have a bunch of employees and they're engaged at work and you're providing a bunch of value to customers and you're making profit that you can reinvest in the business and you're growing and you're well known, right? Like that's kind of what the championship podium looks like. But the path to getting there, you can focus on just like, well, I just got to put up these stats or I just got to get these quarter earnings. Or you can say, I have to pull this more complex lattice of contributors together in a balanced way to get toward that over the next decade plus, instead of just, we got to drive at this. And I think that perspective is something that, I think I don't want to speak for you, but it feels like that more balanced perspective is something that, Ryan Gellert and David Bronner have, to reference who you brought up before, the CEOs leading these innovative companies. And I think it's part of a consciousness that you're trying to promote in this book of, hey, you know what? This is not just my preference to do this, but this is a better way to win the game. And if you can win this way, that's actually winning.
And I think the audience, the market is, I don't know, I'm probably speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but I feel like we're starting to get a little bit better at assessing the extent to which somebody is genuinely, because we all have words and we all have actions. They all don't match 100% of the time, but how big is that gap? And do the deeds actually follow the word? I think like when it comes down to it, that's when it's going to be determined. Like, I don't know, if you are if you're this big badass and you kind of put out this energy and nobody better mess with me, and your girlfriend gets hit on in a bar, well, now we're going to see if you're a badass or not. And like, if you're running a company and you have to make that sort of decision at the margin of which path you're going to go down, and one is going to be, less profitability and one is going to be bigger impact, and you take that, well, that's proof of it. And that sends a massive message, not just to the market, but also to the organization that like, man, when it came down to it and like the chips were on the line, we did the thing that matches the words that we say. Now I can really believe in this. Now this starts to turn into a self-correcting machine or like a perpetual motion machine of like impact or culture. You know what I'm saying? Like it's so powerful, but like so many times we miss those opportunities to really put our money where our mouth is or live up to the story that we've told about ourselves,
Yeah, I really agree. And I think particularly internally, I think that, employees are the ones who really can tell if the company's walking the talk or not. I think, I'm optimistic that, like you're saying, people are getting better at sort of assessing this gap. I mean, we're getting more savvy. There's been so many examples of companies being sort of called out for greenwashing. So I'm hopeful there, although, with all the disinformation that exists in the media today, it's also a challenge. That the external part is more of a challenge, I think, than the internal part.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think because there's a natural facade, there's a natural sort of like marketing ship that like is done in organizations, right? Like there's a lot of, it's so funny you brought that up. Whatever is on the outside of the organization, that's where there's so much focus. And there's usually less focus on like inside, right? But that's one brand. That internal brand and that external brand are the same thing. And the employees have a much clearer view of what that actual brand is, because to your point, they see that internal and they can see that gap between the words that are said in the market and so forth. And that really does create, especially in our current generation, maybe it's not even an age thing. It's just those of us who are working right now. There's been this like sort of, on the employee level or on the market participant level, there has been a shuffling of priorities as well, right? Like our grandfathers believed that they could all be millionaires. The current people coming out of college, very few of them even believe that. So what's going to fill back to that prioritization thing, like what's going to fill that top slot? It's something else. And an organization that is not authentic, I think doesn't resonate as well as, it's just people are more sensitive to it or something,
Yeah, totally.
So Christopher, there's I think a risk here of us all, we're vibing on this. We love this idea, kind of preaching to the choir, right? There's some people, I'm thinking of an adoption curve here, right? And there's some people who are already doing this, who are, formulating the societies and the collaboration that are going to change this, right? They're the innovators. Don't quote me on this, but I bet Scrooge McDuck or a robber baron is not going to see this and be like, all right, I'm going to change all of my priorities. Right. But I think there are a bunch of people kind of interested in this, want to be part of it, like this idea, but don't know how to deconstruct the zeitgeist in order to get there. So those people who are interested, close to doing it, maybe not exactly driving this at the top of their priority list. How can people kind of get closer to changing the world and being the change they want to be in the world for this? Maybe it's a CEO that hasn't really been doing this, or maybe it's just kind of rank and file middle management that want to be part of this. How can people, who are bought into this and love this idea, kind of get closer to being that change in the world?
Sure. So I love your thinking about an adoption curve. I think that's actually, where we are right now in sort of responsible, sustainable, ethical business domain is, I think, before the tipping point in the S curve. Mm-hmm. I think it's and how to actually get to that tipping point is a hugely important question. I think it's not something where there's some silver bullet where, you do this and all of a sudden, things are going to speed up. I think it's, many of the things that we've talked about and you've mentioned. I think one of the things that's so important for these early pioneers is that they are showing this is possible. There need not be a conflict between, the business, mission and actually being sort of responsible citizens. So I think that's a really important thing.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
There's 100 examples of that, by the way.
Yes.
Point.
Yeah. I think, and people, some people, disagree with me on this, but I think that policy is also a very important aspect of this as well. So, the EU is actually introducing a lot of pretty rigorous sustainability and, related type of laws. And these are going to have, I think, huge effects. California actually has a series of them that are very similar, where, even if you aren't in California or in the EU, because your business touches those regions in some ways, or you want to sell to those regions, that will actually, I think, raise the floor too. I think investment is another really important lever to hopefully get us through that. Except
the investment thing also is subject to this.
Totally. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
So totally. So, there, of course, are these sort of ESG investors, which, we've seen sort of some issues with that, with some lawsuits from some US states. But, because many of these investors are so big, actually, many of the, these externalities or sort of implicit type of costs end up getting borne by the investors anyways, because they have, you think of someone like a BlackRock.
Yeah, they have so much exposure.
Yeah. There's ideas that large pension funds and other asset owners like BlackRock are coming to grips with around, it's called universal ownership. And basically it's understanding that because the portfolio is so large, the problems, if one company that might be doing really, really well in your portfolio is throwing trash in the river, and maybe downriver, some other company you own is like a water company, or some other health company, these actually are spilling over into other parts of the company's portfolio. And because they're so large, they really can't avoid them. So the idea that we've looked at for decades and centuries probably in investment of just evaluating one company is actually being replaced, and the people are looking at, whole portfolios. Obviously people are looking at portfolios around sort of investment risk diversification, but also now are starting to look at it as far as, diversification around these different external risks. And so this is another area where there's a new lever, I think, to push companies to be better on these aspects.
I never heard
That's
that
such a cool
term.
idea.
Yeah.
That universal ownership, if you own enough of the market, it's hard to externalize these costs.
Yeah, you're kind of God at that point.
Yeah, and you're getting stuck with them. And so an example of where this is starting to the rubber meet the road, one of the largest investors in McDonald's actually has been been very active
Advocating, yeah.
Their treatment, their sort of beef purchasing guidelines, for example, end up being much higher to get away from antibiotics, to get away from chemicals, because obviously it's a lot cheaper for McDonald's to buy beef through where the cows are all packed in, and so that actually helps their profits. But those have a lot of external sort of implicit type of costs, and the investors are seeing that and saying, McDonald's, you need to sort of upgrade those, upgrade your sort of buying guidelines because of these external reasons.
How much of those reasons in your view do you think are just the shifting sentiments of the market, where people are less attracted to McDonald's because they have that exposure and they've seen the videos of the pink slime turning into chicken nuggets and all of that,
Yeah.
It's a lot of things. I'm not,
Sure.
I don't think I'm arguing it, but it's at least an example of how an activist, or, an investor or somebody who wants to drive some kind of change can start to get some traction on that with enough effort and enough, vision.
Yeah. And I think that, one quote that I came across that is really, resonates with me. You might have heard it. It's from Dwight Eisenhower, this sort of, president for a long time ago. But this was during the time when he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. And, someone asked him, how did you organize all these big invasions, D-Day, whatever? And he said, to sort of solve complex problems, you have to make it bigger. So much advice is sort of breaking things down into smaller aspects. He said, whenever I try to do that, actually, I'm never able to actually solve the problem, but by actually making the problem bigger, I'm able to see connections and sort of umbrella type of strategies that I would not see if I was breaking it down. And I think that to get over this tipping point that we were talking about, just thinking about it as a policy problem or an investment problem or sort of a culture problem, I think we'll miss the issue. I think that we need to be thinking about it as like some integrated systemic type of change, and seeing that these different sectors are reinforcing and trying to design, sort of more comprehensive problems.
It's so funny, man. It's like there's some like religiosity across the world, and most of these religions, again, this is going to be kind of ham-handed, but like they really do take kind of an economic profit view of life, right? Like don't count all, don't worship money, or, what I'm saying? Do things for other people. And yet there are people that are living in that realm and then stepping into the business realm and doing kind of the antithesis of it, because we're just so like, we're so focused on the denomination, oh, that's kind of a pun. The denomination, the dollars, right? Like it's crazy.
Yeah.
There's this dichotomy. Yeah.
Yeah, and that dichotomy, I think, has kind of been forced in the modern era. When Nick and I were in undergrad and we had business classes, the Milton Friedman view of shareholders was spoken to as gospel. We're just going to keep with the religious theme, but it was just like, this is what it is, not like this is a viewpoint or modern way to organize business. It was just like, we've discovered that this is, an axiom.
This is the way. Right?
Yeah. And, I think that takes on many forms, right? That thing that we were taught, I think in a lot of ways kind of seeps into business. And it's just like, well, keep your morality to yourself, and separation of church and business is how to do it. So just run your business and then figure out what you want to do with the profits. And I love that Eisenhower quote of like, you have to see the problem as bigger, because the problem always is bigger, right? It's not just it's not just a battle on this front. It's not just, we need to, do something about recycling plastics. It's part of this broader thing that we're all a part of. And you need to see the bigger problem to like get sustainable solutions, from an environmental perspective, but also sustainable for like our company, whether it's run by a family or a bunch of pension funds, we want that to sustain for the next, 200 years.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, I appreciate as well you bringing up business schools, because that's actually where I've been employed for pretty much all of my professional career. And I think, how people get socialized into sort of a culture of thinking, business should be about profit, and, you should go to church on Sunday, but that actually shouldn't have anything to do with how you're thinking about, your business is, I think, is a lot of culpability as to how these ideas get reinforced. And so one of the things that I've been working on hard here at Cambridge is trying to, help reform the MBA a bit so that there is more sort of sustainability and ethics type of, sort of topics, in the core. And it's a slow battle, but hopefully making progress.
Yeah, keep the good fight up.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to say, you were talking about how, Patagonia and some of these other organizations are really trying to establish some of their own standards. And I just love that thing, that's, it's such a high agency thing to solve their problem. They're not waiting for it to be imposed on them by some policy or some legislation or something like that. They're like, this is a priority for us. How would we solve it? How would we get ourselves comfortable with it? How can we let ourselves sleep at night to do that? And I think that drives actual innovation. It's way faster. It's probably more comprehensive. It's probably a more flexible type of a structure, more sustainable of a type of structure. You know what I mean? And I just think the more of us that can be comfortable with our own prioritization, whether it's an individual level or it's at a company level, and really say, well, that's how I'm going to run my business. That's how I'm going to leave my legacy. And like, if you can give yourself that freedom and that grace to say, I'm not going to just count my, dollars, I'm going to use my, whatever you want to call it, my psychological, income or my, economic impact or whatever to guide me. Well, that loosens up a lot more, and it probably attracts other more like-minded people that you can kind of compound your efforts with and really, make that impact a lot faster. Yeah.
No, I mean, it is, I think, it is an unlock for creativity and innovation. And so, I mean, I don't know if it'll be the next book I write, but at some point I'm going to write a book around all the innovations I've seen in, that I've sort of captured. Because I really do think, I mean, so much in the US culture is, the people in Silicon Valley are like the true innovators, and certainly not to, put down some of the folks there. But I think that actually some of these folks like Dr. Bronner's at Patagonia or Grove Collaborative, I mean, they're actually sort of thinking outside how the system is operating and creating new business models, and new ways of doing business that didn't exist before, really. And so this, I think, is, we need to really sort of change how we think about innovation and how we value innovation, because to me, folks like that should be getting a lot more credit.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the venture capital heroes are the heroes of the accounting profit. And there are these other heroes that have more of that economic profit, to use that dichotomy, that they've done it, right? They've built a great company with a great impact without sacrificing, social impact or environmental impact or whatever. And in some, to just like look at innovation in some ways, right? If you zoom out from just like, did you create a new app, to like, what is innovative in a way that benefits society? Some of those, maybe smaller, they're not as frequently on the Forbes list or whatever, are actually more innovative and actually providing more value to society.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Great.
So, Christopher, we're getting kind of toward a wrap here. I have one more question, and certainly want to make sure that we cover everything that we need. But I would, you talk about in the Profiteers, you talk about this idea that this is not just moralizing. The companies that do this are going to get ahead of the curve as an emerging economic order is formed, right? This is not just you should do it and take your licks and reduce your profit, but this is this is not just maybe like a moral or the right thing to do, but this is a smart way to run a company, because this is the way that companies are heading. I'd love you to see if there's anything we haven't talked about what that looks like, or what the vision that you have for a good company or a bunch of companies doing this, because I think seeing that bigger, not just problem, but that bigger ideal that we're going toward can help some people that are earlier on that adoption curve say, okay, I need to do more of that. So how can you help us envision kind of where this thing should go?
Sure thing. So I think that if you look over the last 100 years in the U.S. and around the world, historians have divided into basically two different periods. So one is more of like a New Deal type of period, and the other next is more of a shareholder type of period. And we're coming up on basically potentially a next new period where you see even like the Business Roundtable are saying we should focus on stakeholders, not just shareholders. These are the largest companies in the world. I mean, that announcement has been sort of taken apart, and actually it's not clear that those companies are actually doing those things. However, I think the fact that they are talking about that suggests that they see that like a new era is on the horizon, where companies are going to be held much more to account for actually how they're doing business in society and in the environment and are sustainable. And so if you think about like tomorrow's environment is going to be much more focused on the overall encompassing sustainability of a business. This is where I think if companies can start introducing some of these issues, where they can get ahead of the curve. And I think that also, the EU, as I mentioned, and California are both actually creating a lot of standards around this too. So it's not just an issue of, large companies seeing this because of the crises. It's actually some policy, policy bite in there too. So one of the ways I like to sort of start talking about this, and other people are talking about this as well, is around the concept of regeneration, actually as an ideal for how business can be thinking about not just, taking from society, or not just actually sustaining how, sort of the world's operating, but actually giving back in of themselves. And really, it was my research on Patagonia that put me on this. So I interviewed someone at Patagonia named Vincent Stanley, who's one of the well-known sort of folks there that does a lot of the sort of writing and communicating externally. And he said, a key change in Patagonia occurred about 10 years ago, right after they bought Patagonia, or not after they bought, after they started Patagonia Provisions. So, Patagonia Provisions is their sort of business unit that, sort of it's foodstuffs. They're doing beer now, all kinds of sort of obviously organic, very sustainably produced stuff. And they realized actually when they got in the organic space, in the agriculture space, that actually by producing things on the land in a thoughtful, sort of right, so to speak, way, actually they could leave the land better than when they originally sort of started planting things. This is the idea of sort of regenerative agriculture. So the soil quality.
If they weren't even open to that, something like that, if they weren't even open to prioritizing this broader impact, they would have never seen that sort of more localized benefit.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, this actually is not even just them being open and seeing it, but then they realized that actually if they could have a net positive gain for the environment and society through agriculture, they should be doing this through their entire business. And so the mission statement of Patagonia for decades, I don't know the whole thing, but it had the phrase in there, and do as little harm as possible, something like that. And they said, Vincent Stanley said to me, he said, this really got us thinking, like, if we're saying in our mission statement to do as little harm as possible, that means that we're actually doing harm.
Yeah, a little harm's acceptable.
Well, but still the idea
implicitly, I'm saying.
Yeah, right.
I'm saying implicitly in that statement, we're saying we'll take a little bit of harm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, maybe assuming that you can't avoid it.
Right.
Right. However, they said, okay, so our experience in agriculture has showed us that if you're thoughtful in how you actually make things, we don't have to harm. We can actually, do better and promote. So this idea, as you may know, they changed their mission statement a number of years ago to sort of we're in business to save our home planet. Now they, like I mentioned, this work they're doing with Dr. Bronner's, so they're deep in supply chains around trying to reform around regeneration. They now have this repair and secondhand and sort of promoting reuse, promoting extended life. So for their apparel business now, they have the vision. They're trying to think like, okay, how can we actually create, a regenerative, giving back business in apparel? And this has led to all these sort of different sort of new practice innovations I mentioned. So I think, this is an example of where, if you think about actually not just taking or not just being sustainable for some stakeholders, but actually your core business, how it can actually give back. I think that is where companies are going to be able to compete well in the future.
Well, there's this discovery process. We have to go. Are we done? I just have to say one more thing.
Sure, great. I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, so there's this what's great about starting to think about the economic profit is you start to look under different things. And what you end up finding are some of the deadweight losses that are actually weighing down your accounting profits and you don't even know it. Like a perfect example of a deadweight loss is when you're like riding a road bike and those tires are a little bit flat.
Yeah.
So you're pedaling super hard, but you're not going as fast as you could be because there's some deadweight loss in your system. And what you're talking about is because they started to pursue this, they said, wow, there's some deadweight loss here that by fixing this and pursuing this actual goal, we're able to leave it better and actually perhaps make some more money. And I'm just saying there's dozens and dozens of examples like that, right? Like I don't want to really invest in a speak up program. I mean, this is kind of our business, but this is a great example of it. Well, if you can make that investment and you can actually try to give people a voice in your organization, you can start to reduce that deadweight loss of turnover and lower than optimal employee engagement in your organization. And that's akin to, hey, I've been riding this bike for a long time. I didn't even notice how flat these tires are. You know what I'm saying? Like there's all of this waste and loss in our organizations. And it's almost like until you kind of put on a new set of glasses, some of those things you like can't even see,
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
I love this conversation.
Great
this could have been 2 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Super.
Yeah. So Christopher, I appreciate you writing this book. I appreciate you coming on the show and helping advance the conversation and open our eyes and the eyes of our audience, in the eyes of everyone who read your book, to this broader concept of you can be part of the ecosystem in a way that doesn't just draw from it, but gives back and doesn't just take your profits and hopefully do something good with them so you could put your name on a building somewhere, but business can be a force for good. And we can enter this new paradigm of internal, not just, what I love about it is not just bear these costs, but once you put your eyes on these costs that your business has been externalizing, you can find ways to reinvent that cycle in a way that reduces those costs and also builds your company and your legacy and the impact that you can have for generations to come. So I appreciate your contribution to not just this podcast, but this broader conversation. I encourage everyone who's a fan, a listener, a subscriber to EthicsVerse, check out The Profiteers and read it and share it with somebody who you can share it with your Uncle Scrooge, or you can share it with someone who's like-minded, and let's work together to advance this view that business should be externalizing those costs, owning all of their full impact, and being a force for good in the world. Anything else you want to leave us with before we wrap up, Christopher?
No, that was really an awesome summary, Gio. So thanks a lot, and I appreciate you mentioning people should take a look at the book and share it with Uncle Scrooges.
Because we're going to win them over. They're not too far gone.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All right. See you guys next time. Thanks for joining us.
Excellent.
Thanks for coming
super. Thanks. Really appreciate it, guys. Take care.